Dallas, Texas, August 26th. That's 2 weeks from the day I'm posting this. There will be a screening of the Jones Plantation. Yeehaw. I will be there. Amanda will be there. Andrew, the director, will be there. Guy who plays Mr. Jones will be there. I think we're going to have some other surprise guests of other people who are in the movie. I think. I'm not even sure who, but I think a couple more are going to be there. So if you don't yet have tickets to that and want to see it on the big screen, check the description below for the link of how to get tickets. August 26th, Dallas, Texas. I wanted to make a video that is kind of relevant to what's going on right now. Somebody copied the Jones Plantation movie, as we knew they would, and stuck it on Odyssey, and someone else stuck it on YouTube, and there were complaints, and they took it down, because to post it on those things, you have to violate the conditions that you agreed to before posting there, because both of those platforms, and lots of platforms, say if you're posting content somebody else made without their permission, that's a violation of their own policies. And so that's that. But it brings up the concept of intellectual property, which to me brings up a wider concept, because I don't believe in intellectual property. But people do this weird thing of they come up with these ideas and these concepts, and they forget what they're based on. They forget what they came from. So basically, almost everything I talk about when they talk about political philosophy, it all stems from the idea of self-ownership. Even that is kind of a weird thing, and some people complain about, well, if I own myself, then I could sell myself, and, well, you kind of can. But by self-ownership, I just mean, ownership means the exclusive right to decide what is done with something. And self-ownership, by that I mean, I get to decide what's done with this, with my time and effort and my body and everything else, and nobody else has the right to, violate my consent. And so what I produce with my time and energy is mine, and I can trade it with others, and so on and so forth. Pretty basic concept. That's the foundation of individualism, is that the individual has the right to control himself, or owns himself, for shorthand. So when people come up with something like rights, for example, like, I have a right to do this, and then other people say, there's no such thing as rights. They're just made up things. Well, yeah, kind of, but no. The only way in which the concept of a right means anything is a statement of a negative. I've explained this before. To say I have the right to say what I want only means it's morally wrong for somebody else to forcibly stop me from being able to say what I want. The right to be armed. All that means is it's morally wrong for somebody to forcibly disarm you for no good reason, like when you haven't threatened or harmed anybody. But these concepts come along, and then when, for example, people talk about rights, they talk about them as if there's like this pile of rights you have. And if you keep in mind where the concept came from and the logic that led to it, it makes a lot more sense. Otherwise, you start clinging to ideas that, when you forget where it came from, the ideas take on a life of their own, but then when they don't make sense, people cling to them anyway. An example I could use is like the concept of gravity is like, gravity says things go down. Well, no. Actually, gravity says that everything with mass, protons and neutrons, and every other thing, basically every combination of two things with mass, has a pole between them that is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, and you can have the whole equation of g m1 m2 over r squared, or d squared, depending on which one you're doing. That's the actual concept of gravity that's measurable and repeatable. But if somebody just says, things go down, that's gravity, and then you show them a helium balloon and it goes up, oh my God, there isn't gravity because a helium balloon just went up. No, actually, it goes up because of gravity, but you have to understand things like density and the mass of air versus the mass of helium. The whole reason it goes up is because helium has a lower mass at room temperature than air, So the air is actually falling down and pushing it up the same way a bubble goes up in a pool. So anyway, the point is, if you oversimplify a concept and you think the rule of gravity is that things go down, and then you find something that doesn't fit that, if you don't know where the concept or the idea came from, then you just go, But if you watch where it came from, it makes perfect sense. So how does this tie into the concept of intellectual property? Well, intellectual property isn't exactly a thing, but a lot of people think in terms of, is it property or not, and nothing else, and they forget where all of the concepts came from. So, for example, if I write a song and it's out there and somebody copies it, and then they have a copy of the song, I didn't lose anything. I still have my song. So it's not the same as if I own a car and somebody takes my car. They have my car, I don't have my car, they stole it. So ideas and information don't function the same way as property. So yeah, intellectual property isn't a thing. And you can do all sorts of examples, like if I learn about some clever way to, like if I tell someone a trick for how to drive in ice and snow and they're not used to it, and they go, oh, okay, thanks. And I'll say, yeah, but you have to pay me $1 every time you do it. It's like, no. Like, I have the idea in my own head now. You explained it to me. Now I understand it. You don't get to charge me for something I know just because it came from you. That's ridiculous. And I wouldn't have the right to use force against them every time they drive in the snow and use the trick without paying me. That's stupid. So that's an example of, that's not my property. That idea isn't, I'm not the only one who has the right to use that idea. So that's kind of obvious. And that's why people say intellectual property isn't a thing. But if you forget where it came from, you start to argue stupid stuff. For example, if, let's just make up a hypothetical, let's say I and some people I know made a movie. You might be able to imagine that. We're not obligated to give it to anybody unless somebody actually made a deal ahead of time. Like if people donated with the agreement they'd get a copy, then they get a copy. But if we just make something, we don't have any obligation to give it to anyone. We created it when we have control over it. Nobody's entitled to it. And it's the same thing as if I'm just playing the piano in my house, I'm just sitting here playing the keyboard or something. Well, that's not your property, so we have a right to hear it. So we have a right to barge in. No, you don't have a right to barge in. I don't have any obligation to ever play it for anybody or let anybody hear it. I have the right to keep everybody out. And if I record it, I don't have an obligation to give it to anybody. And I can even say, I will give this to one person under the condition that they won't let anybody else hear it. And if they agree to that, that's a perfectly valid exchange. And if they give it to somebody else, they committed fraud or however you wanted to describe that, because they didn't, keep up their end of the bargain, because they lied. Now, if somebody else who didn't make any deal with me sees a copy of it and copies it and gives it to somebody else, they had no agreement with me. Now it's just zeros and ones out in the ether, and I don't have the right to initiate violence against them. They didn't do anything to me, and they're sharing that. So, okay, you can say, yeah, and that's a clear example of intellectual property isn't a thing. But people get this weird notion, and they do it with so many things, not just this concept, where they think that, well, if you don't have the right to use violence, then you don't even have the right to be critical of it at all. If I don't have the right to punch somebody out for copying and distributing my song or a movie without the permission of the people who made it, then it must be perfectly fine. And that's just stupid. And so some people get all bitter and whiny when people who create something, whether it's music or movies or something, try to make it a little more difficult for people to copy it and spread it around. You don't have a right to copy and spread around something that somebody else made. You're not entitled to it. You're not magically entitled to something just because it exists. You do have a right in that if you have it, and you didn't get it by fraud or lying or deceit or whatever, and then you pass it on, nobody should punch you out. So you do have that right. That doesn't mean you're not a jerk for doing it, but it's the whether you're a jerk or not, it's like I've talked about that before, but I wanted to do this rant about the weird fact that some people literally get bitter and angry when you try to limit who can access what you produce. And it's sort of ridiculous. It's because they forget where the concepts came from. All they know is, well, intellectual property isn't real property, and I'm not going to think anything beyond that. Okay, well, then you don't know how to think, and you're just being an idiot. Like, if I'm going to do a concert in my house, and, oh, there's some people standing out at the road and watching, I'm going to close the curtains. How dare you close the curtains? You believe in intellectual property, and you're an oppressive... No, you idiot. You're not entitled to what somebody else produces if they don't want to give it to you. Now, on a practical basis, what always happens with music and movies and everything else is they're going to be pirated. They're going to be copied and sent around all over the place. Like, I know that about my music. I knew that was going to happen with the movie. It happens with pretty much everything. That's going to happen. People trying to make it harder for that to happen, they're not somehow bad and evil because they're trying to limit the product of their effort getting to people who didn't pay for it. They have every right to do that. They have every right, which means you don't have the right to use violence against them because they're trying to limit the spread of what they created. Like, if somebody puts a concert on and says, okay, the deal is you can come to this concert for $15 or 20 or 8 zillion if you're Taylor Swift. It's $2,000 or whatever her tickets are. But if part of the agreement is you have to pay this much money and you're not allowed to bring in anything to record it. So the only people who are going to ever hear the show are the people who are there in person, unless the performers record it. Like, they're allowed to make that condition, and you're allowed to decide whether you want that or not. You're not entitled to hear their concert on your terms, on whatever you arbitrarily decide that you should have. They don't have any obligation to give you any deal. And they can, for example, Taylor Swift can say, you can't come to my concert unless you give me $1,000. And if you think that's outrageous, okay, yeah, you can think that, and you're still not entitled to be there. She has the right to do that. Does that mean I believe in intellectual property? No, it means I believe that Taylor Swift owns herself. And so do you, and you can extrapolate the rest just from that. If she creates something, arguing about whether it's property or not misses the point that, okay, she now has this thing she made and she has control of it, in this case a live performance, and she does a live performance on private property and has an agreement with the owners of the private property that people can't come in unless they pay and they don't bring recording devices. Now, I don't even know if that's a condition. Probably not. Everybody has their phones all over the place now. But I'm saying she'd be perfectly justified in doing that. So would anybody else. So it's one thing to say, and again, if you're thinking from the underlying principles and from the concept of self-ownership, both sides of this make sense. No, it's not okay to go beat somebody up because they found something on a torrent site and listened to an album without paying somebody else. Like, they didn't have an agreement. They didn't violate anything. They copied in zeros and ones in a way that had nothing to do with the people who originally generated the content. That's totally true. And it's also totally true that the people who originally generated the content have the right to do whatever they can, which these days isn't much, to try to restrict access to it. And in this digital age, like I said, as soon as it's out there all over the place. Like, anybody making music and movies and any such content is going to know that it's going to be, or books for that matter. Somebody made a really crappy PDF of The Most Dangerous Superstition. Like, tons of typos because they didn't know how to use character recognition and didn't proofread it. But so that's gonna happen, And the fact that that's gonna happen doesn't mean people are entitled to it. And that's just as ridiculous as saying, well, if someone has a snazzy car and for some reason the doors don't lock and the ignition doesn't require a key, well, then it's okay for somebody to take it. No, it isn't. Like, how easy it is to steal something doesn't determine whether stealing it's okay. Now, in the case of information and communication, it's just digital stuff. Like I said, stealing isn't quite the same thing because the person still has it. But the first person who violates the agreement did something wrong. The person who said, yes, I will pay to watch this under the agreement that I'm not passing it on, if that was part of the agreement. If they then pass it on, they did something wrong. They lied. Whether you want to call it fraud or even theft. Because if you paid for something and the thing you paid for was you get to see it, but a condition of the deal was don't pass it on, then yeah, you did something wrong. And both of those can be true and are true. And why some people have a problem with this, I don't know. Well, I sort of do know. Because they try to think in categories where it's like, no, intellectual property isn't a thing. And that's all I can comprehend. And this entire discussion is just about whether intellectual property is a thing. Well, that's sort of one side to look at it and one way to describe it. And yeah, in that setting, intellectual property isn't a thing. That doesn't mean you're magically entitled to what everybody does. And this happens in so many principles. It happens almost in all principles. Even the non-aggression principle is an oversimplification of something that grows out of the concept of self-ownership. Because, for example, the example I've often used, if there's somebody that they're like, they look drunk or something and they're staggering into the street in front of a bus, I may just tackle them out of the way and off the street so they don't get run over. Well, that's me initiating physical force against them without their consent. So did I violate the non-aggression principle? Well, technically, sort of, but the underlying principle, no. I'm assuming they didn't want to die, and I'm assuming retroactively they would consent to, whoa, thanks, sorry, didn't see that bus coming. And there's a guess involved there, but nothing about that violates the underlying principle of that person owns himself. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't want himself to be run over by this bus. So I'm not going to take the time to have a chat with him because here comes the bus. I'm just going to tackle him out of the road and then say, hey, you okay? And he'll probably say, oh, thanks, man. I didn't see that coming. So is that a violation of the non-aggression principle? You could sort of argue it is. You could also argue it isn't. And that entire argument doesn't stinking matter because it's obviously not a violation of the underlying thing that matters, which is his self-ownership. If I saved his life, that wasn't me violating his self-ownership. That was me helping his self-ownership to continue because he's not plastered to the pavement by a bus. So it's weird to watch people cling to these ideas that stem from like more foundational principles, but they lose sight of where it came from and start to argue stupid stuff, and they get all bitter when they're like, oh, you took it down when I posted it on YouTube. Yeah, you posted it on a platform where you have to agree ahead of time, and I know this because I have a YouTube channel, that you're not posting other people's stuff without their permission. That's part of the agreement. You violated that agreement. And if somebody goes to YouTube and says, this person violated their agreement, they didn't make that, these people made that. Oh, the injustice, the oppression. No, dumbass. You violated your agreement and somebody else pointed that out in order to take it down. And when it gets to the point that people who didn't agree anything, like somebody's sharing it on a torrent or somebody and somebody else downloads it, like, oh well, like there's, on a practical level, there's nothing that can be done about that, and it doesn't justify violence. But it's so weird to me that people lose sight of the underlying principles to the point that they argue literally against the underlying principles. Because if I own myself, which I do, and like the people who made the movie own themselves. What we make, okay, that's now ours in a very real sense, as in when we have it under our control, nobody else has the right to decide what is done with that without our consent. They don't have a right to hack in and steal the thing against our wishes. So in that case, you could say, well, that's kind of like owning something. Kind of. And as soon as it's out there so that people can copy it, then it kind of isn't anymore. And if you're stuck in the mindset of whether it counts as owning a thing, it doesn't really work in this case because it's not a physical thing. It's information that can be duplicated an infinite number of times. And so debating whether it's property or not, both answers are wrong. Generally speaking, I'd say I don't believe in intellectual property because of what that's usually shorthand for. But if I record something, if I record a piece of music, and I didn't want to give it to anybody, does anybody else have the right to like hack into my computer or sneak in here and take it? No. Does that mean I own it? Because that's literally saying I have the exclusive right to decide what is done with that piece of music. So that kind of means I own it. Now, do I own the zeros and ones that are it? Like, then you get into the weird conceptual thing because it's not a physical object. And very quickly, as soon as it's released into the world, the practicalities just explode and then the concepts fall apart. But if I challenge anybody who says intellectual property is not a thing at all, because in the general sense, I agree. But I challenge anybody to try to describe for me why it would be okay for them to like hack into my system and get a copy of my song that I haven't released to anybody, that I wrote, I recorded, and I didn't give anybody permission to hear that. Do you have a right to it? Are you entitled to it? How about like any communication I have with anybody or anything I record? My, family album and recordings of discussions with it. Are you entitled to all communication everywhere? No, and you're like a fascist loony if you think the answer is yes. Well, does that mean that people can have the exclusive right to decide what is done with information that they have in their possession? Yeah. Does that mean that they own it? By definition, yeah. Does that change if they release it into the public? Well, yeah, weirdly. Because now they chose to put it out in a place where other people can, as soon as other people can see it and are capable of copying it, that's all going to happen. So the shorthand answer to do you believe in intellectual property is no, because of what that question usually means. But you have to have enough of an understanding of where these things came from to be able to back up and say, yeah, but what does it mean? Because, yeah, I damn well have the exclusive right to decide what is done with a song that I wrote and is right here, and I haven't told anybody else they're allowed to hear it. That's perfectly justified. Nobody's entitled to that. Well, that's ownership. That's the definition of ownership. If I have the exclusive right to decide what's done with it. So in that case, would you call it intellectual property? No, I wouldn't. That's like, you can call it that if you want. But if you don't know how to think in these concepts and you don't know how to think from first principles, like the first principle of self-ownership, then you start arguing stupid stuff that doesn't make any sense. And so I had a debate. Patrick Smith hosted a thing with Stephen Kinsella about intellectual property. And at one point, he decided I would be the bad guy if I made something. It had nothing to do with the movie. It was about a book or music. I don't even remember which. If I put it behind a paywall, then I'm the bad guy. And that was sort of like, whoa, that's weird entitlement mentality commie think, which I did not really expect. For somebody to say, well, as soon as it's out there, you have no enforcement power and you have no right to use violence against people spreading it all over because they didn't agree to anything and you're not losing anything directly. You can say, well, it hurts sales and stuff, and you can, debate that if you feel like it. I don't think I have the right to use force on anybody once it gets out there. But the idea that I'm the bad guy for creating something and then having it behind a paywall is really weird, and it is the opposite of understanding self-ownership. The notion that other people are entitled to something I created, and this is true of anybody else, that's just a weird, completely turning the concept on his head, and now suddenly I don't own myself. What I produce, other people are entitled to, which is all the way completely backwards from the principle that is the foundation for saying I don't have the right to punch somebody out for copying my song without my permission once it's out in the ether. So it's really weird watching people forget where principles came from and then clinging to the principle itself that isn't even a principle. It's just sort of a description of a symptom of the actual principle. But if you get that wrong, like gravity says things go down, and then you see something go up, then your brain explodes because you don't really know what you were talking about to begin with. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of bitter people mad about the fact that, we're not going to make it easy for people to copy this without our permission and without paying for it. It's going to be anyway. People are going to torrent it anyway. We're not going to call out a hit on people or beat people up because that would be unjustified. But when people get into this weird entitlement mentality mode as if, oh, how dare you not give me what you made for free? It's just, okay, commie much? We didn't have to give it to anybody at any price. And we wanted to create this, and we'd also like to make money off of it. And ironically, and here's a thing that, it's been mentioned a million times, but I'll end here by mentioning it again. The people in the freedom movement who think they're being courageous uber anarchists by intentionally copying it, without our blessing and spreading it all over the place, you are doing what those in power most want to have happen, which is to have independent pro-freedom content not be worth making. Because a lot of people, when you have to pay a bunch of money and put in a bunch of time and effort to make something happen, I also want to actually make money off of it. I did another video about the weird thing of people being resentful if someone's successful. But if people can't even break even or can't even get paid for their time, they're just not going to make the stuff. And so the thing that most helps government is if anyone trying to make pro-freedom content, whether it's movies or whatever, can't make any money doing it, and so they're only going to pile in their time and effort if they happen to have enough money from some other source that they don't have to care about that. But you're making there be an obstacle. So all these people who think they're being super duper pro-freedom by spreading it around, without our blessing, without the blessing of the people who actually made the thing, you're just being a giant anchor that's all it's going to accomplish is drag back any incentive for people to put in the time and effort to make really substantive stuff. Because I can babble in front of a video, in front of a camera for almost nothing, and whoop-de-doo if somebody copies that. Notice I have 80 gazillion YouTube videos. They're all free. I don't try to copyright it. I don't do anything to try to protect it. I expect it to get spread all over the place because it's no big loss. It doesn't take a hell of a lot of time and effort. I don't get paid for this. Whoop-de-doo. Every once in a while somebody donates. There's actually, if anybody's wondering why I made so many videos recently, there's one person. There's one person who's been donating a chunk every time I make a video. That's why I made a bunch. And the 99.99% of people who view my videos never donate anything, which is fine. You're not obligated to, and I'm not obligated to make videos. And I don't know why it should be difficult for people to understand both of them. You're not obligated to give me anything. I'm not obligated to give you anything. I want to make these videos. I want to get them out there. When I'm in a position able to do that, I do it a bunch. And if somebody else gives me a financial incentive to do it, I do it even more. Because it helps me out and it frees me up from having to do other things to make money. But it's just weird how many pro-freedom people don't know how to think from first principles, and so they end up being cheerleaders for something that's a detriment to the attempt to get the message out there, and think they're being already, like, these people almost never produce stuff. They're not the ones out there investing time and effort and money into actually creating something, because then they'd say, yeah, even if I don't have the right to punch you out, I hope people would, like, appreciate this enough to pay, like, $10 for the movie. Like, whoop-de-doo, that isn't that much to pay. And if you think you're horribly oppressed because we ask that people pay that in order to see the movie, then don't watch it. Like, you're not being oppressed by not seeing something you didn't make. And yeah, you'll be able to torrent it from somewhere. I'm sure that it's already out there anyway. But this weird, twisted thing that happens because people forget where they started with the concept of self-ownership and wander into these things which ironically turn into literally a condemnation of self-ownership. How dare you limit who can see what you produced? Okay. You need a refresher course in the concept of self-ownership because that's the foundation of it. So anyway, I'll stop ranting about that. And you know, on the practical side of it, that's why bands do tours. Because, like, okay, you know, yeah, you can torrent this Metallica album, but you can't very well make there be a Metallica concert with them in person in your living room. So they'll do that and make money from that. Because you can't really fake a live physical event happening. And so one of the things we do is do screenings of the movie with the director and us there and at an actual theater and all that, because that's a fun, cool event. And it's something that, like, weirdly, we actually encourage people to, like, if you, later there'll be a DVD, but if you buy the movie and have friends over and watch it, like, fine. It's not like we expect everyone to pay for it. Like, you pay for it, you have it, you can show it to whoever you want and stuff, like, with our blessing. And, of course, people will spread it all over the place without our blessing, too. And we're not going to, like I said, set out a hit on anybody for doing that. But it's weird to watch people's brains make excuses to do whatever they want instead of actually starting with the first principles and then building up what should I do based on the foundational premise instead of what can I get away with doing and then retroactively make an excuse for, which is what cops do all the time. It's what politicians do all the time. It's a little bit sad to watch pro-freedom people do that. Like, I'm entitled to this thing I didn't make, and here's my weird mangled justification for why. It's like, no, the fact that somebody shouldn't punch you in the face for it doesn't mean you're entitled to it. There's a difference, you know? So, anyway, I hope our evil, greedy, capitalist, pig dog plot succeeds, and a bunch of you are at the Dallas screening, and if so, I will see you there. Again, August 26th. It's only, I think, 160-seat theater, so it may sell out pretty quick. So if you want your tickets, I don't know why, like, it's kind of pointless to say that, because if you get them, then somebody else didn't. But just giving you fair warning. And I hope to see you there. And we're going to do the thing where you have a meet and greet for a little before the movie, and we show the movie, and then we have question and answer that goes for a while. But we'll be there in person. Amanda and I will be there, and Andrew will be there, and Lee Gallman, Mr. Jones will be there, and I forget who else is going to be there. So, if you want to be there for that momentous occasion, and I very much think it's worth seeing in theaters, I may be biased, but see the description below, because that says how to get tickets. Yeehaw. And you know what? If you try to, like, peek in a window or sneak in the back of the theater, the people who own the theater have the right to stop you and, like, close the window and lock the back door. Oh, the injustice of it all. Come on, people. Stop trying so hard to be a force against spreading these ideas. Okay, that's enough for now. I'll see some of you in Dallas in 2 weeks. Yeehaw.